Have you ever reached a point where you just stopped reaching out? Maybe it was after too many unanswered calls, or maybe the tone of their voice told you more than their words ever could. You didn't slam the door, you didn't make a scene, you just stopped talking. And maybe you're still sitting with that silence, wondering what it means, wondering what they're thinking now that you're no longer the one holding the thread. If you're over 60, like many of our viewers here, you've probably lived long enough to know that family relationships are rarely as simple as love equals closeness. Sometimes love is there, strong and quiet, but the communication breaks down. Sometimes you're the one holding everything together until you just can't anymore. And when you finally stop talking to your children, whether it's for your peace, your pride, or your survival, it's easy to feel like everything just ends. But it doesn't. When you go quiet, something interesting happens. Your children, whether they're 30 or 50, don't just shrug and carry on like nothing happened. Even if they act like they don't care, they do something. Sometimes subtle, sometimes obvious, but always meaningful. In this video, we're going to talk about the real, often unseen things your children do when you stop talking to them. And as we go through this, I want you to know, this isn't about blame. This is about understanding the emotional dance we're all part of, even when we think we've left the floor. Let's start with something that happens almost immediately. Even if they'd never admit it, they start paying attention. Quietly, from a distance. Maybe they're not calling. Maybe they're not even responding to your last message. But that doesn't mean they're not noticing. When you stop reaching out, there's a shift in the air. Your absence becomes a presence. Suddenly, they're checking your Facebook to see if you've posted. They're asking a sibling or cousin, "Hey, have you heard from Mom lately?" And they don't always do it with concern. They might sound annoyed, dismissive, or aloof. But that question is there. And it wasn't there before you pulled back. They may even start testing the waters in small, almost invisible ways. A birthday text that's late but still arrives. A comment on an old photo. A vague message that reads, "Hope you're doing well," and nothing more. It's not a full conversation, but it's not silence either. It's them poking the silence to see if it still holds. They're trying to gauge whether you're still hurt or whether you've moved on. And whether they'll admit it or not, they're wondering, did I push too far? Did I let too much time go by? And here's where it gets interesting. When you stop initiating, your children often feel something they haven't felt in a long time. The weight of responsibility. For years, maybe even decades, you were the emotional engine. The one who made the effort. The one who smoothed things over, remembered birthdays, checked in just because. And when that stops, the silence becomes a mirror. They start seeing the gap and realizing they didn't fill it. That realization stirs something deep, sometimes guilt, sometimes fear, sometimes resentment. But whatever the emotion, it gets them thinking. And that's a powerful thing. Now, not all thoughts turn into action, but many do. And one of the first actions your child might take, whether it's obvious or not, is rewriting the story. They'll start justifying the distance to themselves. Well, she stopped calling first. Or, he never really understood me anyway. They start creating mental reasons for the silence because facing the pain is too hard. That's human. It's not right, it's not fair, but it's how many people cope. So if you hear through the grapevine that they're telling people, "Oh, we haven't talked in months because she got upset over something small," just remember, that's not about you. That's about them trying to protect themselves from the discomfort of the truth. And sometimes, this is the part that hurts. They get angry. Not because you did something wrong, but because your silence is louder than any word you've ever said. When you stop talking, you take away their ability to ignore the problem. And that can trigger defensiveness. They might lash out, say hurtful things, or accuse you of being cold, selfish, dramatic. But what they're really doing is showing you that they feel the void. People don't get angry about what doesn't matter. So even if their reaction seems negative, know that it means your silence mattered. There's also another reaction that's more subtle, one that can take weeks or even months to notice. Your child might start reflecting, quietly, privately, without a word to you. They start playing back old conversations in their mind. They remember the times you showed up, the times you forgave, the times you gave even when they didn't say thank you. And as they reflect, they begin to see things not through the lens of the moment, but through the long arc of history. That kind of reflection takes time, but it's one of the most powerful seeds your silence can plant. Because silence isn't just absence, it's a boundary. And boundaries, when held with love, have a way of teaching the lessons words can't. Some children respond quickly. Others take months, even years. But the moment you stop speaking from a place of hurt and start holding space for your own healing, something in the dynamic begins to shift. They feel it, even if they don't say a word. I want to pause here and remind you, if you've stopped talking to your child, that doesn't make you a bad parent. Sometimes silence is the only voice we have left, and sometimes it's the most honest one. You're not cutting them off. You're stepping back from a pattern that wasn't serving you. And in doing so, you're giving both of you a chance to see things clearly. Now, what happens next can vary, but there's one thing that stays consistent. The emotional ripple your silence creates never goes unnoticed. Even when they pretend not to care. Even when they try to act unaffected. That ripple starts stirring things in their heart, and how they respond next will tell you more than words ever could. When someone you love starts to feel your absence, they don't always run toward you. Sometimes they go inward. They withdraw, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to handle the feeling. And this is where things can get really confusing. Your silence might not push your children to reach out right away. In fact, it might look like they've pulled back even further. But here's the truth. Emotional distance doesn't always mean emotional detachment. What often happens next is a kind of emotional disguise. Your child may start acting like they're doing better than ever. Suddenly their life looks full. Maybe they're traveling, posting happy pictures, talking about how at peace they feel. But if you've lived long enough, and I know you have, you can see through the surface. When someone goes out of their way to prove they're unaffected, it usually means they're not as untouched as they claim. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to convince themselves that they're okay without you, that they didn't need the connection as much as they actually did. But that's the thing about family. You can't just replace it with distraction. The relationship may be strained, but it still lives in their bones. And even if they never say it out loud, they feel the tension of your silence. Especially if you've always been the one who showed up. Now sometimes, especially if your child is prideful or emotionally guarded, they'll start to rewrite the dynamic in their own mind. They may start telling themselves and others, "We don't talk anymore because my mom always made me feel guilty," or "My dad never really listened." Again, this isn't necessarily the full truth. It's a coping mechanism. People don't want to feel abandoned. So instead, they flip the story to make it feel like they were the ones doing the leaving. It's hard to hear that, I know. But it's also a sign that your absence has power. Not in a manipulative way, but in a meaningful way. It means your role mattered more than they might have acknowledged when things were comfortable. And now that the comfort is gone, they're forced to look at what's missing. That awareness often shows up in small changes, like how they talk to others about you, how they respond when your name comes up, or how nostalgic they get about childhood memories. You might hear through someone else that they brought you up, that they mentioned an old recipe you used to make, or a lesson you once taught them. That's not coincidence. That's a heart that's still connected, even if the phone isn't. And sometimes that quiet reflection can lead to a powerful shift, the beginning of real empathy. This is when your child starts to realize that you're human too, that you've hurt, that you've waited, that you've tried. And while they might not be ready to say it out loud, they begin to understand that the silence wasn't rejection, it was protection. You weren't punishing them. You were preserving your peace. And then comes one of the most telling behaviors of all. They test the waters. Not with a grand apology or a deep conversation. No, it's usually something simple. Maybe they send you a meme. Maybe they ask about something random, like, "What was that name of the restaurant we used to go to?" It's not about the restaurant. It's about seeing if the door is still open. They don't want to dive in head first. They want to tap on the glass, see if it breaks. And this is where it's important to stay grounded. Because how you respond in those moments sets the tone for everything that comes after. If you respond with bitterness, it confirms their fears. If you rush to welcome them back like nothing happened, they might think the behavior that caused the distance doesn't need to change. But if you respond calmly, kindly, and with quiet boundaries, it teaches them something deeper. That love doesn't disappear, but self-respect has its place. That's a hard line to walk, especially when your heart wants nothing more than to reconnect. But you didn't come this far just to go back to an old pattern. You stepped back for a reason. And now you have the chance to create something stronger, if and when they're ready to meet you halfway. Another thing your child might do is reach out to other people in your circle. They'll ask siblings how you're doing. They'll ask cousins if you're okay. They might even fish for updates from old neighbors or mutual friends. They're trying to piece together your state of mind without confronting you directly. This happens more often than people think, especially in families where communication has always been a little indirect. These secondhand questions mean one thing. They're thinking about you. They're wondering what's going on in your heart. And sometimes that curiosity is the first step toward accountability. It means they're no longer justifying the silence. They're starting to feel the absence. And they want to know, is the door still open, even just a crack? Some children will also try to reconnect, but only on their terms. They'll text you once every couple of months, or call just long enough to ease their conscience. Not because they're ready to change, but because they want to keep the thread alive without doing the real work. This is where it's especially important to protect your peace. You have every right to say, "I'm not ready for small talk." When you're ready to talk about what happened, I'm here. Because here's the truth no one likes to admit. Sometimes people come back not because they miss you, but because they miss the comfort of you. They miss the way you made things easy, the way you forgave quickly, the way you absorbed the tension so they didn't have to feel it. But you've grown now. You've learned that love without boundaries leads to burnout. And you're allowed to ask for more. You're allowed to want a relationship that feels mutual, not one-sided. You're allowed to want real effort, not emotional scraps. And when you hold that standard, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, you create a space where real reconciliation becomes possible. Not the kind where everyone pretends nothing happened, but the kind where healing can truly begin. It may not happen today. It may not happen this year. But your silence, when rooted in clarity and care, is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different kind of conversation, one where you're not begging to be seen, but finally being seen for who you really are. When you've lived through enough heartache to finally step back from someone you love, especially your own child, it's not something you do lightly. You may not have slammed the door, but you quietly decided not to knock anymore. And with that, you claimed something powerful, your right to peace. But peace doesn't mean nothing is happening. Far from it. Sometimes silence speaks so loudly that it makes your child begin to feel the consequences in ways they never expected. One of the most complex things that can happen after you go quiet is this. They try to pull you back into the same old pattern without ever acknowledging what caused the break. They might send a picture of the grandkids out of nowhere. They might tag you in a post that feels cheerful, even nostalgic. On the surface, it looks like reconnection, but underneath, it might be avoidance. Not every gesture is rooted in love. Sometimes it's about comfort. It's about pretending that nothing really broke. And that's where you have to be careful. Because here's the truth. Just because someone reaches out doesn't mean they've changed. Your silence might have stirred something in them, but it may not have stirred growth. And you don't want to reopen your heart only to end up in the same place again, exhausted and unheard. That's why this moment, this space you've created, matters. It gives you clarity. It gives them time to reflect. And it gives both of you the opportunity to reconnect for real, not just out of habit. Some children will come back slowly, cautiously, not with dramatic apologies, but with subtle signs that they're softening. Maybe they ask about your health. Maybe they recall a fond memory from years ago. Maybe they sit with you a little longer during a family gathering. These moments may feel small, but they're real, and they deserve your attention. But there's something else that may happen, and this is the one that's hardest to witness. They might move on, or at least try to. They might stop asking. They might stop checking in. They might build a new life, fully believing the silence between you is permanent. And you know what? That's okay too. Because the truth is, not every relationship is meant to be restored exactly as it was. Sometimes love has to change shape. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do, for you and for them, is let go of the version of the relationship that kept hurting you. Letting go doesn't mean you've stopped loving. It just means you've stopped bleeding. But here's the beautiful thing. Even when it feels like your child has truly moved on, it's not always the full story. People, especially adult children, can be incredibly good at pretending. They bury the ache under work, under relationships, under new routines. But there's a quiet tug that remains. And sometimes that tug brings them back, just not in the way you expect. They may come to you one day, years later, and talk about things they never mentioned before. They may say, "I didn't realize how much you did until I became a parent." Or, "I didn't know how much you loved me until I started feeling alone." These words often come slowly, softly, but they come. And they land deep. Not because they erase the pain, but because they validate it. And even if they never say it, the change might show in how they treat you, in how they protect your time, in how they finally stop taking you for granted, in how they begin to listen, really listen, when you speak. But for that to happen, you have to hold the line. You have to let the silence do its work. That doesn't mean staying angry. That doesn't mean giving them the cold shoulder. It means holding space. Quiet, respectful space. Space where accountability can grow. Space where love can finally be mutual. Because you've spent enough years giving without return. You've earned the right to receive as much as you give. You've earned the right to boundaries. And if someone truly loves you, especially your own child, they will meet you there. And if they don't, you're still whole. You are still worthy of peace, joy, connection, with or without their participation. Life doesn't end when a relationship changes. Sometimes it begins again, with new depth, new grace, and new people who truly see you. So if you're sitting in silence right now, wondering what your children are thinking, wondering what comes next, just remember, your silence is not wasted. It's not the absence of love. It's the presence of wisdom. It's you saying, "I matter too." And sometimes, that's the only message that needs to be heard before healing can finally begin. Maybe you didn't expect your life to look like this. Maybe you pictured holidays full of laughter, birthdays surrounded by hugs, grandkids running into your arms without hesitation. But life isn't always like the picture we painted. Sometimes it takes a turn we never saw coming. And sometimes we find ourselves sitting in silence, wondering how we ended up on the other side of a relationship we once poured our heart into. But here's something I want you to know deep in your bones. The silence you chose wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. It was strength. It was the kind of courage that comes from years of learning how to survive heartbreak without losing your kindness. You're not here because you gave up. You're here because finally, you stopped giving away pieces of yourself to someone who wasn't ready to value them. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. And that clarity gives you something rare and powerful in later life: emotional freedom. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Of course it does. You carried this child in your arms, in your heart, in your thoughts, every single day for decades. That kind of love doesn't just disappear, but it also doesn't mean you have to keep showing up for a version of the relationship that leaves you feeling invisible. Love doesn't always mean contact. Sometimes it means letting go without letting go of yourself. And if you've made it this far, through the waiting, the wondering, the waves of sadness that sometimes come out of nowhere, let me tell you something with absolute certainty. You are not alone. There are thousands, maybe millions of other parents in this world who quietly stepped back, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much to keep getting hurt. And something else happens in that space too. You start remembering who you were before all the tension, before the worry. You begin to rediscover the parts of yourself that got buried under years of giving, fixing, explaining, hoping. And the longer you stay in that stillness, the more you begin to feel free. Free to enjoy the little things again. Free to laugh without waiting for the phone to ring. Free to say no without guilt. Free to spend your energy on people who show up with love and presence, not conditions. And yes, sometimes they do come back. Not with empty words, but with a changed heart. With humility. With accountability. With an understanding that took them years to grow into. And when that happens, you'll know. You won't have to guess. Because real return doesn't hide behind small talk. It shows up with truth. But whether they come back or not, the story of your life doesn't end with them. You still have pages to fill, conversations to have, hands to hold. Sunrises to sit with and sunsets to smile through. There is life beyond the silence. And joy is not only possible, it's waiting for you. If you found comfort in this video, if something I've said helped you feel seen or understood, I want to invite you to share your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it. There's strength in shared experience, and there's healing in honest conversation. You are part of a community here, one that believes in dignity, in love that doesn't hurt, and in choosing peace even when it's hard. And if you haven't already, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to Strong Elderly Life. We're building something here, something real, something kind, something rooted in the belief that it's never too late to live with more grace, more wisdom, and more strength than ever before. So, as we close this conversation, let me leave you with this. You did what you had to do to protect your peace. And that doesn't make you a bad parent. It makes you a person who finally remembered they mattered too. Here's to living your truth, honoring your heart, and holding space for the love you deserve, no matter what age you are. Stay strong, stay kind, and above all, stay rooted in your worth. I'll see you in the next one.